So Hahnemann had the good sense to think this was nonsense. And he said, I'm just not going to practice this kind of medicine. So what he did, because he knew all these languages, he made his living translating from various medical texts in other languages into German. Now, what happened was one day he was translating from a work by a Scotsman named Cullen, Dr. Cullen, and Cullen was writing about the effects of cinchona bark. Now, cinchona bark was used to treat intermittent fever, which is what they called malaria. And cinchona bark contains quinine, and quinine is still used to treat malaria. At any rate, Hahnemann was reading and translating, and he comes to the part on the stomach, and Cullen made a certain statement about the effects of cinchona bark on the stomach, and Hahnemann said, I don't agree with this. I had intermittent fever in the past. I took cinchona bark. It didn't have that effect on my stomach. I wonder why he wrote it. So he was a very curious man, Hahnemann was. So he decided to do a little experiment, which was to take some cinchona bark. Remember, he's healthy. So he starts taking cinchona bark, just like he would if he had intermittent fever. And after some hours, he started to feel sick. And he continued taking it, and he got sicker and sicker. And he started recording his symptoms. And he found that they were very similar to the symptoms he'd experienced when he had intermittent fever. He stopped taking cinchona bark, and he returned to his normal state of health. So he thought to himself, this is really pretty interesting. Cinchona bark is used to treat intermittent fever. I didn't have it just now, but I took it, and it produced symptoms very, very similar to cinchona bark. I wonder if that's the reason cinchona bark is so effective in intermittent fever. So, because he was a very experimentally minded man, he started giving cinchona bark to other healthy people, and they also fell sick in a similar way. And then he made a note of all these symptoms. So by this time he was so interested that he began to experiment with other medicinal substances that were well known in his time of in that 18th century period. And he would always try them out on himself, and he would always make extensive notes on how it affected his thinking, his sensation, his emotional state, and all parts of the body. And then he would give it to other people, men and women, and he would record all the symptoms that were produced. These symptoms, which are produced by a medicine we call the pathogenesis of the drug, or he called it a proving. And the idea is that he proved that a certain medicine would cause these symptoms. So after he had proved a certain number of medicines which came from plants, minerals, and some animal products, he then thought, well, now I'm going to really put my theory to the test. I'm going to start treating people and see if it works out. So people would come in, and they would say, Doctor, I have this, that, and the other thing. And he would encourage them to speak, encourage them to elaborate, and then he would ask them certain questions. You say you have a pain in the right knee. What makes it better? What makes it worse? Does heat make it better? Does cold make it better or worse? Does movement make it better or worse? Does standing make it better or worse? How about sitting? How about lying? How about the time of day? On and on. Are you restless with it? Are you very calm with it? You say you have a fever. When does the fever come? Does it come every day? Twice a day? Every other day? Every 4 days? Do you have sweats with it? Or do you just have heat? Do you have chills with it? Do you have chills and sweats and heat? And in what order? On and on. Great, great detail. When he got it, all the time he was listening to these people, making notes, he was thinking in the back of his mind, well, such and such a medicine has that, such and such a medicine has this, on and on until he found a good correspondence. So the idea is, with homeopathy, I said earlier, it's a matching game. We're trying to find a medicine that corresponds as fully as possible with the symptoms that the patient has. Now, those of you who have already been interviewed by me know that I spend a lot of time asking about your life, what your interests are, as well as aches and pains and things like that. Because if we're going to treat a person, it only makes sense that we want a medicine that corresponds with their disposition. If you have a very curious person, a very intellectually alive person, you don't want to give a medicine for a dullard or a kind of cretin type. And similarly, if you have a kind of cretin, stupid type, you don't want to give a medicine for a very curious person. Or if you have a person who's very angry, you don't want to give a medicine for a very soft, loving, sweet person, and vice versa. So it goes on and on. It's important that the medicine correspond with the essential traits of the personality. Although we're not necessarily treating the personality, but we don't want to sort of go against the personality. Now, in psychology, in some forms of psychology, there's an interesting treatment for fear. It's called exposure to the fear. And the reason I'm bringing this up is that we think that this idea of treating like with like, that's another way we say it. Instead of homeopathy, we say like treats like cures like, or we say the law of similars. All this means the same thing. So there are some psychologists who say you had a fear of bees, and it was like a phobic fear. So that if a bee flies into the restaurant, you go ah, and or you freeze, or whatever you do. You just can't stand to have a bee around you. You're afraid it's going to sting you, and maybe you'll die, and so on and so forth. It's totally irrational. What do? First of all, they'll take a picture of a bee, and they'll hold it some feet away, and the person will go, it's only a picture, just look at it for a while. So they look at it and look at it and look at it exposed. Finally they calm down. Maybe the next day they come in and they say, you see that box across the room? There's a dead bee in it. I want you to go look at it. So they get up their courage, they go, lots of terror, they look at it, they stay looking at it, and eventually they calm down. All right? Then maybe they get them to touch a dead bee. And then maybe they put a live bee in a jar, and so on and so forth, until they can be around a bee. They cure the phobia through exposure. Like cures like. Okay? Very important thing. Everything we do is based on this idea that like cures like. Now, we have an expression in homeopathy, and the expression is, we want to treat the illness, but we want to also treat the person who's having the illness. We want to know something about how the person's reacting to their illness. So we call this, and Hahnemann was the first to call it this, the totality of the symptoms. The totality of the symptoms. So, if a person has digestive symptoms, we ask them all we can about the digestive symptoms, if it's pain or bloating or indigestion or diarrhea or constipation or reflux or whatever it is, various pains. And then we go into other things. You have any other physical problems? We have hypertension. We have a rash. We have this. We have headaches, on and on. So we take all these things into account. We're building the totality of the symptoms. And we want to know about some of the emotional symptoms. Do you have any fears? Do you have any worries? Do you have any anxieties? Do you suffer? Have you had any great fright? Have you had any great grief? And sometimes people will mention a grief and they'll even start crying in the interview, which suggests that the grief is still present. Now,